So we are continuing. We have one more week left in this series where we are looking at the last week of Jesus' life before Easter, what we call Passion Week, before his resurrection, and how that parallels into the life of prayer. If you'd like to follow along and read the scriptures and the quotes, you can do so by going to the sermon notes tab, and you click the worship, and then find the sermon notes there. So today's message is using the day of Holy Saturday to parallel into our prayer life. And we've been going deeper and deeper into this idea of silence in this series. What do we do when God's not there? But Holy Saturday is the epitome of silence. See, there's times in life, experiences, which really become problematic for us because God does not speak. He does not act. He does not give a word through another person. He does not open or shut a door. And oftentimes that becomes our test, and it also becomes the space of spiritual growth. We can either grow closer to God, or our faith can suffer the most. So as we look at what is really the most mysterious day in Christianity, the day of Holy Saturday, we're going to try to figure out how we can grow from it and how it can help us in our prayer life. So if we're not careful, we can skip over Holy Saturday in Holy Week. Good Friday has a lot of importance because it's the day that Jesus hung on the cross and died. And Easter, of course, is very important to us. It is the most important day in our Christian season, our year, and in the lives of Christians. It's the day that Christ rose and overcame death. But Saturday is easy to pass over. I want to read a quote for you, and that's this. In our fear of unknowing, we leapfrog Holy Saturday and rush the resurrection. We race disconcerted to make meaning and find beauty where there is simply none yet. From dusk on Good Friday to dawn on Easter Sunday, God allowed the whole of creation to remain in a state of chaos and despair. Last week, we focused on Friday. We looked at the prayer that Jesus had on the cross. The words that he gave to God when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And that feeling of Jesus verbalizing, feeling abandoned by God. And if Jesus felt abandoned, then we ourselves shouldn't feel bad if we feel abandoned by God. But there's so little we know about Holy Saturday, we tend to just skip it. So I want to invite you today to just sit for a bit with the unknown and the unsettled as we try to live into a little of this space of in-between. Now to start, I want to invite you into Psalm 22, because what I didn't share with you last week is that when Christ said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He was quoting Psalm 22. Now this is a long psalm, so I'm not going to read every verse of it. I'm going to pick some key passages out of the chapter, but I would love for you to go home later and read the entire thing. But there's a pattern in it of the psalmist crying out to God, of suffering and despair, and then worshiping praises to God, and then back to the despair and back to the praises. So I want you to see some of that in here, starting in verse 1. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far away when I groan for help? Every day I call to you, my God, but you do not answer. Every night you hear my voice, but I find no relief. You hear the pain and the hardship in that. But if we move on to verse 3, we get the flip side. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. Our ancestors trusted you and you rescued them. So do you hear the flip? You've got someone who feels abandoned and alone, but yet remembers the history of trust and praise. They cried out to you and they were saved. They trusted in you and were never disgraced. The psalmist is remembering the history of Israel, and that although this person feels alone, that the history says that God shows up. If we jump down to verse 11. Do not stay so far from me, for trouble is near and no one else can help me. Back to the suffering. And then verse 16, my enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. An evil gang closes in on me, and they have pierced my hands and feet. Can you picture that for Jesus on the cross? He's surrounded by his enemies, and his hands and feet have been pierced. I can count all my bones. My enemies stare at me and gloat. They divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing. We didn't really expect the book of Psalms to be a book of prophecy, did we? But this tells exactly as Jesus was treated as they threw lots for who got Jesus' belongings on the cross. If we go back down now to 27, the whole earth will acknowledge the Lord and return to him. We're back to the praise. All the families of the nations will bow down before him, for royal power belongs to the Lord. He rules all the nations. The psalmist has been talking about how the enemies are everywhere, but remembers that everything belongs to God and he will rule all. Verse 30, our children will also serve him. Future generations will hear about the wonders of the Lord. His righteous acts will be told to those not yet born. They will hear about everything he has done. It's my thought that for Jesus, as he quoted the beginning of this psalm, that he was remembering all that was in it. You see, every psalm, all 150 in the book of Psalms, every first verse is unique. And it was not uncommon in the Jewish culture for them to say just the first line to recall the entire psalm, because they knew the Psalms by the first line. So when Jesus said just the one, it was him bringing the entire psalm to his mind. And I imagine for someone who knew the Bible quite well, as Jesus did, that he was not just remembering the psalmist crying out to God in agony, but remembering the praises that the psalmist did. You see, for most of us, when we are somewhere in the in-between places, we live between the cross and the resurrection. We either tilt towards the cross of living in the things that Jesus did for us, remembering all of our sin and carrying the guilt of all we've done wrong and all of these things, and we live there too much. Or we live so much in the resurrection that we forget what he has done. We forget the sacrifice. We forget what he has conquered. And we don't anymore remember where we have been. But Saturday represents the space between. Saturday represents the unsurety, the silence, the confusion. For the followers of Jesus, they didn't know what was going on. They did not know what was going to come. They feared for their lives, and it was their day of worship. Because remember, on Friday, they had to take Jesus down from the cross and get him buried before the sun went down, because on Sabbath they could not do anything. So they woke up Saturday morning and they had to honor the Sabbath. And they had to get up and go to their houses of worship. And some went to the temple, and some went to synagogues, and only the very special people worshiped in the temple, and the rest went to synagogues, and they had to act like everything was normal, because we do know that many of them had to gather secretly behind locked doors, because a little bit we're told about this day, they were being hunted, and they gathered together scared. They worshiped so that people would not think that they were afraid publicly, but they gathered to protect themselves. They wanted to look normal, but they grieved and they questioned, and they're trying to figure out how the God who sent the Messiah could allow the Messiah to be killed. And was he really the one they thought? And what was happening? And how could Jesus allow this to be happening to himself if he was the one they thought he was? And they didn't know what to do. When we think about this in our own lives today, we forget how much doubt and confusion had to be in this space on Saturday. And so many times we pick on Thomas after the resurrection for still being in a place of doubt, but they all were doubting and confused on Saturday. But the truth is that when we have faith, sometimes we carry our own faith and we live into our own faith. But most of the time, our faith isn't enough, and we need the faith of others to carry us through. And we see in Scripture many times that it's other people's faith that does amazing things. Jesus healed people not because of the faith of the person, but the faith of the friends. He told the disciples that they couldn't heal because their faith wasn't enough. Which our first thing to realize in the struggle and in the silence and in the in-between places is when we don't have the strength, when we don't have the faith, when we don't know where to go, that's where the community comes in. Because we may not have the faith and we may be in the place of doubt, but other people may be stronger than us in this moment, and it's okay. Allow them to be the strength we're without. Many of you are probably like me, and you remember watching and the witness of the life of Mother Teresa. After she died, the Vatican collected the journals of her life, and most of her life she doubted her worthiness and her calling in life. And she doubted her faith. It's hard to believe of someone that we saw so much good come of, and someone that the world would all agree is the most recent Catholic saint. But the Catholic Church states to this day that the path of doubt and faith is the most maturing process in Christianity. I'd like to read another quote for you, but this one comes from C.S. Lewis. He says this: "When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing Him, God, so happy that you are tempted to feel God's claims upon you as an interruption. If you remember yourself and turn to Him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcome with open arms. But go to God when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. And what do you find? A door slammed in your face. A sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. Have any of you felt like that? That when you desperately needed God, you did not find Him there. After that silence, you may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once, and that seemingly was as strong as this. What can it mean? Why is he so present, a commander in other times of prosperity, and so very absent, a help in time of trouble? See, friends, this is the paradox, is that we feel God's presence so much when life seems to be going okay, but when we desperately need him, we can't seem to figure out where he is. When we desperately need a word, we can't hear. For the disciples, they gathered together to gain support from one another in their struggle. It's believed that they gathered back at Bethany, the same place where they were at the day of Palm Sunday when Jesus came into the city and everybody shouted, Hosanna. The same place where Mary washed Jesus' feet and poured the perfume upon him. The same place where Simon the leper was healed. See, this place, this house where they had so many wonderful memories, it was just outside the place where they lost him. Must have at least had some comfort because it had positive memories. And the reality is that for us, we must find places that help us feel rooted and connected to God. Either a place where we have a memory or we're grounded for some reason. But oftentimes we don't get still enough to feel the connection. And it's hard. This year starts my 10th year as an appointed pastor. That's mind-blowing for me, that it's year 10. I feel like we just left Kentucky in graduation. But out of all the years I have now served, I hear over and over people say, I never hear God speaking to me. So I want to do an exercise with you. We've been talking about this silence and embracing the silence. So today we're going to embrace the silence a little bit. And I'll be honest, this will be the most uncomfortable thing for me to stand here while you sit. But we're going to embrace the uncomfortability together. So for a moment, if you would, you can open your eyes, you can close your eyes, you can stare at the floor, you can do whatever you want. But I just want you to sit, and I want you to say your name in your head to yourself. It should sound like your own voice. Unless you're really creative and you can create character voices, and if so, I envy you because I'm not that way. But if you can imagine your own voice being said to yourself, that is the whisper that you can hear when you hear God. 9 times out of 10, when we hear from God, we dismiss it as being ourself or not from him. Now, I want you to sit in this space and realizing that you're not crazy for having your self-conscious bring thoughts to your mind. And we're going to ask God questions. And just give him a moment to bring an answer. And if you don't like the questions I'm giving you, you can ask God another question. That's okay. But this is just so you don't have to come up with things from scratch. But the first question for us with God today is this. God, what is it that you like about me? You just take a moment and ask him. Get a thought. Don't throw it out thinking it's something else. Just embrace whatever comes to your mind. And I want you to ask God, what's making you sad right now? And the last thing is this. If God could ask you one question, what would the question from God be to you?